Unit 2 is Psychology's Big Issues and Approaches. So we're going to start with psychology's biggest question, and this is going to be a theme that is brought up over and over again throughout the course. It's called nature versus nurture. So basically the question is, are our human traits present at birth, or do they develop through experience? Is it genes, or is it what happens to us? Is it nature, or is it nurture? And so psychologists today see our traits and behaviors as the product of both nature and nurture. Whereas over time, some people have blamed just nurture and some people have blamed just nature. But today we see it as a combination of both. So starting with Darwin and natural selection. So Charles Darwin, of course, you probably recognize him from his book called On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. And in his book, he proposed his theory of evolution and natural selection. The principle that among the range of inherited trait variations, those contributing to reproduction and survival will most likely be passed on to succeeding generations. For most things, we can say nurture works on what nature endows, meaning that we are born with certain predispositions and traits. But our environment and our experiences may change or influence our behavior. Okay, so when we look at psychology, there are actually three main levels of analysis. The levels of analysis are really the differing complementary views from biological to psychological to social cultural for analyzing any given phenomenon. And then when we combine them all together, we get the biopsychosocial approach, which is an integrated approach that incorporates biological, psychological, and social cultural levels of analysis. So just as an example, if you're facing the question of why do mass shootings happen, if you're looking at it from a biological standpoint, those biological psychologists will say, is there something genetically wrong with the shooter's brain? From a psychological standpoint, have people in the shooter's life rewarded bad behavior and led him to believe that what he's doing is okay? And from a social cultural standpoint, is American culture too lenient on gun purchases? So looking at them individually, you can see which each level of analysis can be asked and analyzed. But if you put them all together, we would look at all of these things to analyze why mass shootings happen. Okay, so let's look at psychology's different approaches. And we're going to do modules or units on each one of these different approaches as we go through the year. So this is just a basic introduction to the different kinds of approaches we will be studying. So first is behavioral psychology. This is the scientific study of observable behavior and its explanation by principles of learning. So for example, how do we learn to fear particular objects or situations? Okay, so that's all based on our actual behavior. Then there's biological psychology. It's the scientific study of the links between biological and psychological processes. So biological meaning like genetic, neural, hormonal, those types of processes. How do those and psychological processes in your brain work together? So for example, how do pain messages travel from the hand to the brain? And to what extent are traits like intelligence and personality attributable to our genes? Okay, another approach is cognitive psychology. It's the scientific study of all the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. So for example, how do we use information in remembering, in reasoning, in solving problems? Another approach is evolutionary psychology. It's the study of the evolution of behavior and mind using principles of natural selection. So for example, how does evolution predict or influence our behavior? Then there's psychodynamic psychology. This would be the one that's branched from Sigmund Freud. It's a branch of psychology that studies how unconscious drives and conflicts influence our behavior. And it uses information to treat people with psychological disorders. So for example, how can someone's personality traits and disorders be explained by unfulfilled wishes and childhood traumas? What has happened to them in the past that has made them think the way that they think today? And then there's social cultural psychology. It's the study of how situations and cultures affect our behavior and thinking. So how are we alike as members of one human family, and how do we differ as products of our environment? Do people in America think differently than people in Asia, or people in Africa, or people in Europe? How has our society influenced the way that we think? Okay, and then psychology has a bunch of subfields as well. For example, psychometrics is the scientific study of the measurement of human abilities, attitudes, and traits. So an example of psychometrics would be IQ testing and personality testing. So psychometrics is all about measuring things, using numbers and analyzing data, things like that. So within these different approaches to psychology, we have two different subfields. We have basic research and applied research. So with basic research, these are the pure science fields that aim to increase scientific knowledge. For example, like this is a new species, let's observe this animal and try to learn more about it. So all it is researching and trying to increase our knowledge. So in basic research for biological psychologists, they look for links between the brain and the mind. For developmental psychologists, they study our changing abilities throughout our life. Cognitive psychologists experiment with how we perceive, think, and solve problems. Educational psychologists study influences on teaching and learning. Personality psychologists investigate personality traits. And social psychologists explore how we view and affect one another. On the applied research side, this is scientific study that aims to solve practical problems. So rather than just studying and increasing our knowledge, they actually want to apply it and fix things. So for example, some people are developing a certain defect in their eyeballs. Let's find out a way to cure this defect. So they're taking knowledge and applying it. So within this subfield, we have industrial organizational psychologists who apply psychological concepts and methods to optimizing behavior in workplaces. Then there's human factor psychologists, which is kind of a subfield of industrial organizational psychology. They explore how people and machines interact and how machines and physical environments can be made safe and easy to use. Then there's counseling psychologists. They assist people with problems in living, usually related to school or work or marriage or something like that, and in achieving a greater well-being. Clinical psychologists study, assess, and treat people with psychological disorders. Psychiatrists, who are actual physicians or doctors, provide medical treatments such as drugs, as well as psychological therapy. Positive psychology is the scientific study of human functioning with the goals of discovering and promoting strengths and virtues that help individuals and communities thrive. And then community psychologists study how people interact with their social environments and how social institutions affect individuals and groups. Okay, one example of an early psychologist who worked in this applied research field was Dorothea Dix. She worked really hard in the 1800s to improve the lives of the mentally ill. Prior to her involvement, most people with mental illnesses were actually housed in prisons with serious criminals. And these facilities were usually inhumane and dangerous. So Dorothea Dix worked to establish asylums and hospitals and better prison conditions. Okay, so this is just a blurb in your textbook about how psychology's principles can help you learn, remember, and do better on the actual AP psychology exam, or any exam actually. And it's called the testing effect. It says that enhanced memory, the testing effect is enhanced memory after retrieving rather than simply rereading information. And it's also sometimes referred to as a retrieval practice effect or a test-enhanced learning. So instead of just, basically what it's trying to tell you is that instead of just rereading information over and over and over, quiz yourself, practice, things like that. Make yourself retrieve the information rather than just read it over and over and over. One way to do this is the SQ3R approach. It's a study method incorporating 5 steps: survey, question, read, retrieve, review. And just some additional study tips: distribute your study time. Don't try to cram everything at the last minute. Learn to think critically rather than just memorize. Process class information actively instead of just mindlessly typing notes. Think about it. As you're typing, ask questions, make different notes in the margins. Overlearn. Don't overestimate how much you know. And be a smart test taker. Read the questions first. Think about what the question is asking you. And then look at all of your answer options and analyze them to find the one that best answers the question.